I'm going to spend some time talking about Street Fighter. Now, as any gamer knows, when it comes to fighting games, especially 2D fighting games, Street Fighter is the top game. It is arguably the most popular fighting game within video games. The closest it has to a rival is probably Mortal Kombat, but Street Fighter has a whole other level to it. Now, Street Fighter's been around since the late 80s. Back then, you could play as either Ryu or Ken in a game where you fight in a traditional arcade ladder mode. Now, even though there were other characters, you only got to play as Ryu or Ken. They were the original main characters of Street Fighter. And at the end of the game, you defeat the gods, and then you win. That's it. Street Fighter 2 changed things up by adding a little more variety. Instead of just having two characters, you get to play as 8 characters. You still do the ladder thing from the first game, but you no longer limited to just the same 2 characters, and now you can pick one of these 8 characters to be your playable character. So they brought back Ryu and Ken as so, but with the 6 other characters, you have Chun-Li, who is considered the most popular female in fighting games and video games in general. You have Guile, another very popular Street Fighter character, Dalsim, Blanca, Zangief, and Ihanda. So these were the 8 characters from different parts of the world, which add a little um, cultural variety in a smart way. And then, as the games went on, as there were still some NPCs in this game, the 4 main bosses of Shadowloo, including the final boss Bison. But this game got a re-release, which made those 4 bosses playable. This is before time of DLC, so if a game needed an update, the game needed to be re-released. That still happens nowadays to an extent, but here this was a must. So, and then there was another update which added 4 more characters, and then one final update which I believe added Akuma as the final boss. And I think there were more that had balance patches and changes. So again, this was before DLC. They could have sent out a patch. They had to re-release the game. I would say that it's probably because this was originally an arcade game too. The arcade games could get these updates, but the home consoles were not. They couldn't get updates like that. And this kind of followed into Street Fighter 3, which had multiple versions of itself. Regardless, Street Fighter 2 was the most popular, or at least the biggest, the biggest bar set for the Street Fighter franchise. So you have several things going for it. It had a TV show. It had an animated movie. It had a live action movie. I don't think anyone liked the live action, but whatever. And then uh, it just from here, whenever people think about Street Fighter and its characters, you have this game that they go to because it has the most iconic characters, or at least the most popular ones. And Street Fighter has continued on. I have mentioned Street Fighter 3. And then there's also Street Fighter Alpha, or Street Fighter Zero, as it's called in Japan, because Street Fighter Alpha was kind of a prequel. It took place between Street Fighter 1 and Street Fighter 2. So, it was. Street Fighter does have a story mode. It's not really talked about much because some fans just want to play and get good at the game. But, like any good video game, every character has a bit of story. And that's what kind of makes it interesting for me, at least, because if I'm going to play as a character, I want to know more about this character and why he or she has this motivation. Ryu, he's the main character. He gets a bit of development. His whole thing is just trying to master the Satsui no Hado and not let it take over him. But for the most part, he is a flat character, not unlike Mario or Sonic, as we discussed before. His point is to make other characters grow. His best friend Ken, he had the growth. He starts off as this arrogant guy who thinks he can do everything. Spent some time training Japan, and then he became a little, I don't want to say enlightened, but he just grew up, and now he's a father, and he's trying to do better he wants to do good for his family. So Chun-Li is considered one of the most popular females, not only in fighting games, but also in video games in general. Her thing is to get revenge on Bison because of what he's done to her family, and she recruits Guile for that. Now you could say that for considering Shadow is the main villain of the franchise, Chun-Li and Guile could be considered the main heroes because they're actively fighting the main villains. Ryu doesn't go after Bison. He's not the hero type. He just happens to run into Bison a few times now, and and then he ends up fighting him. Now, not to say that Ryu doesn't care. It's kind of like with Goku in Dragon Ball. Goku doesn't set out to fight the bad guys. It just happens. Ryu's the same way. He doesn't set out to fight these bad guys. At the same time, he won't ignore injustice if he sees it. Ryu's story mostly relates to Akuma rather than Bison. But Street Fighter had continued on over the years, whether you like the story or not. You have increased gameplay, increased mechanics. Street Fighter 4 was a big one. Came out in the late 2000s. Like at the time, fighting games were kind of not doing so well. Thanks to a man named Ono, I'm sorry if I messed up the name. He brought back Street Fighter. He created Street Fighter 4, and once again, fighting games had a resurgence. This was good for the industry, not just for Street Fighter. It was good for Mortal Kombat. It was good for Fatal Fury and the King of Fighters franchise. It brought and good for Tekken. It brought back the interest. And Street Fighter 4 was a great game. I was a little annoyed when they did Super Street Fighter 4 instead of doing DLC. They just re-released the game again. Like, yeah, this is their DLC. Why would you re-release the game? I remember not buying it at first because I was so annoyed, but over time, I saw it on sale one day. It was really cheap. I'm like, yeah, whatever, I'll grab it. So, but then Street Fighter V came along, and they didn't do the whole Super Street Fighter V thing. At least they did DLC. Street Fighter V was criticized for being kind of bare in content. It didn't have a lot other than just fighting, you just fought. I think it was just a single player versus CPU or single player versus second player, stuff like that. As the game went on, then it started getting stuff like the arcade modes and all these other modes, so no longer felt bare. But it probably didn't help that game only released with I think 16 characters, which is a lot, but for modern day stuff, it's not enough. Then, funny enough, Street Fighter 6 comes out with only 18 characters, and boy, Street Fighter 6 has its own issues, given one, it seemed like they wanted to replace Ryu as the main character with some guy named Luke. Two, they have they're doing this. They focus a lot of their DLC on a single player mode that nobody really cares that much about. I mean, you can play for fun, but to have stuff like a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles crossover and a Spy Cross Family crossover and relegate that to just the single player mode instead of doing something for the actual main game, that's just a little ridiculous. And this had other issues that other games in the industry are now falling under, including the recent Tekken game. But Street Fighter 6 is fun. It just has so many issues, and it just has me worried about the future of the franchise. I think my concern was it becoming too Americanized, a same concern I had with Sonic and Resident Evil. It's a Japanese franchise and needs to have its Japanese roots. Nothing wrong with American input, but keep it Japanese if you can. Then, the Street Fighter is, regardless, Street Fighter has quite the legacy. It has done several crossovers over the years. It's done crossovers with the King of Fighters franchise and Capcom versus SNK. It's a weird name because it's called Capcom versus SNK, but most of the characters come from Street Fighter or King of Fighters. Of course, Capcom side did have Morrigan from Darkstalkers, and the SNK side had some Samurai Showdown characters, at least before Samurai Showdown became part of the SNK thing. Like, I could get into this King of Fighters thing, but that's going to distract from this video, so I'll save that for another time if I get to it. It's done crossovers with Tekken. You have Street Fighter Cross Tekken, which is properly named. Street Fighter characters versus Tekken characters, obviously. Get the game on PlayStation, you get to play as Cole McGrath from the Infamous games. I'm not sure what came up with that idea, but hey, it worked, I guess. So, and then the biggest crossover they probably did was X-Men versus Street Fighter. Back in the day, X-Men was really big with its old TV show, and then you have Street Fighter becoming big, and X-Men already had X-Men Children of the Atom, which was made by Capcom. So eventually they just used their resources to do a crossover, and it worked. The perfect rivalry of East and West. It was an iconic crossover that became the Marvel vs. Capcom franchise, one of the most popular gaming crossovers. The only other gaming crossover that could probably rival it was probably Super Smash Bros., something Ryu was part of, and can eventually. But that just shows the legacy that Street Fighter has. It's a huge franchise. It's been around for a while, and it's getting bigger. Actually, it's already pretty big. So uh, the one thing they need to do is make sure it maintains its momentum and doesn't fall. But just stick with it, and I think we'll just hope for the best and make sure Capcom remembers what Street Fighter is. Still, it's Street Fighter competitive game. Me, I'm not super competitive when I play Street Fighter. I just want to have a good time and enjoy myself. I still want to get good at these characters, but over the years, I've stuck with guys like Ryu and Ken as characters, and Chun-Li, even though she's a bit tricky to figure out, but there's still a lot of good characters I play as. Rashid in Street Fighter V is one of my favorites. I like playing as Manon in Street Fighter 6. Um, Super Street Fighter 4 had characters like Judy Han, so she's a fun character to play as. Those are my characters. Street Fighter is still again. I've enjoyed Street Fighter 6 as gameplay wise, and it has some interesting new characters. So, and I will say that the only criticism is that it brought back too many Street Fighter 2 characters, but I guess that's not so bad. But balance it out with more. I mean, yeah, they brought back Juri, they brought back Rashid was DLC, but at least he came back. Just yeah, make sure don't get carried away with this stuff, Capcom. Just keep it level with Street Fighter. Okay, that's all I have to say. Storm Dash is signing off. Goodbye.